You've built the foundation, you've developed the skills. So why do so many leaders who know exactly what to do still struggle to do it consistently? Today, we're talking about the missing piece and why it doesn't just change one leader, it changes entire organizations. Well, welcome back to the Frontline Leadership Podcast, where we help frontline leaders become professional leaders that transform their business bottom lines in the process. I'm your host, Craig Coyle, former Apache helicopter pilot, aerospace leader, and founder of Operation Lead. This is episode 8 of our launch series, and today we're making a pivotal move. We're leaving flight school behind and stepping into the second pillar of the Lead Like a Pilot framework, Preflight. So let's dive in. This entire podcast launch series has been grounded in the challenges and the reality we face in our manufacturing and greater industrial workplaces today. We've talked about and we've identified that our frontline leaders are the people who stand in the gap, the ones we have to rely upon to help solve these challenges. And then we've started talking about the Lead Like a Pilot framework and how it will help us develop these frontline leaders into leaders that consistently create results. Then we dove into the first pillar of that framework, flight school, and we broke that up over the course of 2 episodes. We talked about ground school, and it gave us the foundation. It talked about who we need to become as leaders. We talked about principles, mindsets, emotional intelligence, things that anchor us in who we need to become. And then flight training, last week, we talked about the skills. We talked about the what we need to do as leaders. We broke that down into 4 categories: aviate, communicate, navigate, and contingencies. This is what professional leadership looks like in practice. Essentially, flight school helped us lay a foundation and start to build some structure on top of it. But here's the question that rarely gets asked after the training ends. How do you make sure it actually shows up every single day? Here's the reality. Knowledge without routine is potential without performance. And that gap, the gap that's between what leaders know and what they consistently do on the floor each and every day, that's the gap where most organizations quietly lose the game. It's exactly what the second and third pillar of the Lead Like a Pilot framework address. And this week, we're talking strictly about pillar number 2, which is pre-flight. It's the daily and weekly operating routine that takes everything flight school built and turns it into consistent, scalable leadership performance, specifically on the front lines. And here's what makes it different from anything your organization has tried before. It doesn't work for just one leader. It works for every leader at every level, simultaneously. And that's what we're building today. Now, I know most of the leaders, manufacturing leaders, other industry leaders, the senior leaders I'm talking to today have spent years mastering, designing, building systems that scale operations throughout their organizations. They've done it through Lean, Six Sigma, total quality. You guys are professionals at this. But here's what these systems don't do. They don't scale leadership. They scale management. Yes, they create operational consistency, but they do it without building the human capability beneath it. And as a result, unintentionally, they create doers instead of leaders in our leadership positions in the middle and lower tiers of our organization. And that's why we still struggle with engagement and retention today. It's because our systems have one fatal flaw. They fail to address the fuel behind our systems. which is our people. Now, here's what changes when pre-flight is embraced at every level of an organization, not just by the frontline supervisors, but by every leader at every tier. First, the mission's nest. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, the senior leader's strategic priorities connect directly to what the supervisor on the front lines is communicating with their team that morning, not because of a mandate, but because every leader is operating from the same framework, adapted to their level and their people. Second, the language becomes shared throughout the entire organization, especially within leadership tiers. Line stops being something you enforce from the top and starts being something that the organization generates from within. In essence, the system flips the org chart upside down. Everything flows seamlessly downhill from top to front lines to empower and support execution on the front lines. And third, leadership becomes self-reinforcing. You're no longer depending on one exceptional plant manager to hold the entire culture together and drive results. No, the system develops leaders. It creates consistency. And when you do that, the system scales and produces reliable results. This is what the military figured out long ago. You don't scale great leadership by creating rigid executors and operators. No, you give every leader at every level the same operating framework. And then you trust the system to develop them and produce the results. That's what pre-flight makes possible in your organization. So what does pre-flight even really mean? Well, in aviation, before every single flight, regardless of experience, regardless of how many times you've flown the route or flown that aircraft or flown with that crew, every pilot performs their pre-flight routine. Not because they forget how to fly, not because they haven't done something similar before, but because consistent preparation is what separates professionals from amateurs. It's how you mitigate risk. It's how you maximize success. It's how you simplify the process of knowledge application. In aviation, our routines and checklists are standardized in structure. They're adapted fresh every single time, regardless of the aircraft, weather, mission, crew. It's the same rigorous preparation. It goes beyond just making sure the aircraft's ready to fly. It's everything a pilot does to prepare themselves and their crew to accomplish the mission that they've been placed in charge of. The leadership translation is direct. Your supervisors aren't struggling to lead because they don't care. They're working their you-know-what's off. They're simply a product of the system that already exists. A system that's focused on management, accountability, and outcome. The very things we teach them where they learn themselves about leadership atrophy and slowly get choked out of their to-do list because they aren't prioritized or enforced throughout the entire organization and within the operating systems the organization runs on. But pre-flight gives you and them a framework to change that. It's structured enough to create consistency, but flexible enough to fit each team, each mission, and each context. Now, many of you experienced in manufacturing or maybe healthcare are probably thinking, well, this sounds a lot like leader standard work. And there's an overlap that's worth acknowledging. But here's the distinction I want to clearly articulate. Leader standard work was manufacturing's attempt to scale organizational systems down to the frontline level. And yes, that's part of what we're trying to address. It works. But for managing processes, what it misses is the people side, the leadership side, the things that turn a manager into a leader who actually empowers and activates a team. That's what we're after addressing. So no, Preflight isn't here to replace leader standard work. It's here to complete it. In the military, leaders are taught a simple principle. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. At its core, Preflight is a planning routine, an executional bridge that mitigates risk and enables operational success. And isn't that our function as leaders? If pilots can make it routine, then so can we. So what does this framework look like? Well, we've built this out into a full free resource, the Leaders Preflight Checklist, and it's available to everyone to download at operationlead.com/checklist. It's built as a baseline for manufacturing environments, and it's designed to be adapted to your specific context, whether that's a different industry, a different team. There's no plug and play here. Just like no two flights are identical, no two leadership environments are either. So keep that in mind as we walk through the 5 categories of this framework, or as you walk through the 12 steps in the checklist, that it's a baseline and it's a starting point. And it's meant for you to then use and massage for what's needed for your environment. The pre-flight framework is broken down into 5 sections. The first is mission details. In aviation, before any flight, the crew has to establish exactly what the mission is. Where are they going? When do they have to be there by? What do they have to accomplish on the way or when they get there? What does success look like? No ambiguity, no assumptions. In leadership, we can directly translate this to our teams as well. Every supervisor on your floor needs to know what their team's mission is today, this week, this quarter, and how it connects to where your organization is going. So let me ask you this. If you asked your frontline supervisors right now, what does winning look like this week? Do you think they'd give you an immediate and instinctive answer? Because if not, I guarantee you their team doesn't know what winning looks like either. Part number 2 is crew responsibilities. See, in aviation, every crew member has a defined role. It's briefed and it's clearly delegated by the pilot in command of the aircraft they're a part of. When complexity increases, the pilot doesn't try to do everything. No, we're taught not to. We're taught to prepare and brief our crew. And in leadership, clarity of roles and responsibilities doesn't just live at the management level. It has to exist on the front line where the work happens. And it's critical that our frontline leaders are clearly communicating and delegating responsibilities and how those responsibilities tie to the mission on a routine cadence. So does every person in your organization know exactly what they're responsible for today, why it's so important, and how it connects to their teams and their organization's goals? Number 3 is emergency actions. And we talked about this in depth last week as we started walking through the concept of flight training. But this has to show up in our pre-flight as well. See, in aviation, pilots don't just figure out emergency procedures during the emergency, and they don't just train them in a simulator. No, they brief them and talk about them prior to each and every flight. They analyze the mission they're about to go on. They think about what types of situations, what potential emergencies are most likely to manifest given their mission. In leadership, this is important for us to think about too. What can we think about? What can we see potentially happening in the day or week ahead? Unprepared leaders react, but prepared leaders, they don't just respond. They see into the future and prepare accordingly. So are your supervisors forward-looking and analyzing the potential emergencies they or their team need to be prepared for today or this week? Number 4 is aircraft checks. I mean, this is what we think about when we think of the term pre-flight, right? It's Tom Cruise outside of his aircraft, putting his hand across the fuselage. Before every flight, the captain confirms the aircraft is fit for the mission and ready to go. That's systems, it's equipment, it's instruments. Everything has to be verified before wheels up. This applies in leadership too, right? Do our supervisors know how to assess whether their team has what it needs to succeed? And are they doing it consistently? What does that consistent routine need to look like? So here's the question to ask. How many production problems trace back not to a process failure, but to a leader who didn't verify readiness before the work began? And then 5, and arguably the most important section of Preflight, is a concept called fighter management. In aviation, a fatigued or distracted pilot is a danger to every single person on the flight. Self-assessment is an option. It's a pre-flight requirement. It's actually the final requirement that pilots are required to talk about with each other before they step into the aircraft. As leaders, we need to understand how to do this self-assessment as well. Our energy, our clarity, our presence sets the tone for everybody on our team. And a leader who isn't fit to lead that day doesn't just underperform. They actively undermine themselves, and unfortunately, it influences the people around them too. So here's a question to think about. Are you or your leaders showing up as the leaders their teams need? And do you have a framework for asking yourself whether or not you are each and every single day? Now, that's a brief overview of the 5 sections of the concept and pillar of Preflight. But here's what I want you to do with it. First, go to operationlead.com/checklist and download the Leaders Preflight Checklist. It's going to take these 5 categories and break them down into 12 steps. Every leader in your organization, down to your very frontline leaders, can follow on a routine basis in order to put their flight school concepts of leadership to use. It's meant to be a starting point. Use it as your baseline, adapt it to your context, and start building a leadership operating system that's yours and that scales. But here's the key. Keep it simple. Remember that complexity is the enemy in leadership, especially for new frontline leaders. And if you're a senior leader thinking about what it would look like to build this systematically across your entire organization, visit operationlead.com and click Learn About Our System and Process. No pressure, no pitch, just a conversation about what's possible when you create the infrastructure that empowers every leader on your team and in your organization to actually lead. Here's what matters. Flight school built the foundation and the skills, helped us identify who we need to become and what we need to do. Well, Preflight builds the routine that makes both of those ideas show up consistently and routinely, not just in one leader, but across every level of the organization. Remember, the goal was never just to develop one great leader. It's always to build a system that develops great leaders, consistent, at scale, from the top of the organization all the way to the floor, because that's where we truly impact the workforce. Next week, we close out the Lead Like a Pilot framework with a 3rd and final pillar, progression. Foundation and routine are in place. Now we talk about how leaders keep going and why the organizations that sustain performance are the ones that never stop building their people. But before we do, take one of those 5 sections and ask yourself honestly, does this exist at every level in your organization right now? Until next week, I'm Craig Coyle, and this is the Frontline Leadership Podcast. Let's lead.